Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. As many of you know, I'm Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our lecture tonight with Professor Maxine Grossman, who will be exploring the Dead Sea Sectarians, a righteous remnant in a fallen world. Thank you to our generous sponsor, Mary Hammer, who dedicates this lecture in heartfelt memory of her beloved husband, Arnie Hammer, and her dear cousin, Rabbi Ruvain Hammer, who was a treasured scholar and teacher for the Haberman Institute. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our fall 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site or a personal or professional achievement or milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering these lectures free of charge for all participants. Our next program is a series with Rachel Korazim, a master teacher of Israeli poetry. Even if poetry isn't your primary area of study, learning with Rachel is a true delight. She brings Jewish and Israeli history, culture, and art to life in many remarkable ways. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep them as concise as possible and in complete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Maxine Grossman is an associate professor of religious studies and Jewish studies and director of the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Program and Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Maryland. Her areas of scholarship include ancient Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, methods and theories in the study of religion, and contemporary constructions of religious identity. Her publications include articles, essays, and reference pieces on the sectarian Dead Sea Scrolls, priesthood, marriage and sexuality, and religious identity, as well as such books as Reading for History in the Damascus Document, a methodological study, and the edited volume, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, an assessment of old and new methods. Professor Grossman served for a decade as founding co-editor of the Journal of Ancient Judaism and is currently an area editor for Brill's forthcoming Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And with that, I now welcome Professor Grossman to join us and share her expertise with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. And we'll get started. Can everyone see? Or can you see, Matt?
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much. It is really a pleasure to be here with the Haberman Institute and your wonderful staff and friends and participants. I'm a big fan of everything that you all do, your programs and your courses, and I have very fond memories of Rabbi Haberman from when I first came to this area 25 years ago. It's a pleasure to be with you because of the way that you all build intellectual community and a kind of community of joy around learning. I also want to take a moment to thank Andrew R. Ammerman and Mary Hammer for their very generous contributions, both to the whole series this fall and to this evening's lecture. I'm so grateful to you all for valuing Jewish studies and for making these lectures possible for all of us. My topic today is the Dead Sea Sectarians, a righteous remnant in a fallen world. I think you'll see that that is an aspirational title. That is who they thought they were. I'm not sure it's necessarily what we're going to say about them by the time we get to the end of the evening. It's always a pleasure to talk about the scrolls, not only because I've spent so much time working on them myself, but because I think they have a kind of intrinsic fascination. And I know that the people who are here at this talk are here not only because you're interested in the scrolls, but because you probably already know a lot about them. And so you're here to take my spin on what they have to tell us. I'm betting that you all know or are very familiar with the story of the the missing goat and the dog and the boy going in search of his goat and throwing the rocks in the cave. And you probably all know the stories of the first discoveries from Cave 1, a set of 7 scrolls that all seem to point to a community that's very concerned about end times. And then from there, the discovery of more scrolls, more caves, and more scrolls, eventually a total of 11 caves and well over 900 manuscripts. Again, I'm sure you know about the way that the scrolls have contributed to our understanding of biblical studies. And some of you, it sounds like, have done a lot of work on the Book of Jubilees. It sounds like there was a wonderful class on that. And the Book of Jubilees is important as a backdrop to what we do because it presents us with an understanding of Scripture and an understanding of the history of Israel that's very specific and targeted. So when I talk about these Dead Sea sectarians, I hope you'll keep in mind that they not only have the Jewish Bible as a backdrop to their thought process, but they also have the Jewish Bible as understood through the lens of the Book of Jubilees, which means that they have particular understandings of all of the patriarchs and matriarchs. They feel sort of close to them in terms of their values, and they share a set of legal traditions that are interwoven into Scripture and into the stories of Scripture as Jubilees presents it. Now, don't worry if you weren't in that Haberman Institute class, because that's all we'll say about Jubilees for now. What I'd like to do at this point, though, is to focus on those people, to ask questions about the people associated with the scrolls and the movement that we are going to identify as Dead Sea sectarians. Now, a lot of people have names for these folks, and my students know that I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the names that are applied from the outside. In particular, the reference to the Essenes will come into play in this conversation, but I want y'all to recognize 2 things about the use of that term. The first is that it's a name that's given by outside interpreters and describers who are looking at the Qumran sectarians from a distance of time and geography and also culture. Our scrolls sectarians were writing and thinking in Hebrew and Aramaic. The people who wrote about the Essenes were writing and thinking in Greek. They were looking at a people they had heard of or knew about. But we're going to see with the scrolls sectarians that they overlap with that definition, but that they don't fully comprise themselves under the title of Essene. That's something we can talk about at the end, but it's kind of like the thing I have to say every time I talk about the scrolls. In that moment, then, I think we can turn to a discussion of those people, whether they were Essenes or not. We know that they were sectarian and that they had a particular and special theology and outlook on their world. So I want to start this evening with the idea of sectarians and the hazards of perfection. One of the things I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately is the idea of a perfection theology and the way that thinking about one's own desire for perfection connects one with a God who is already perfect. And so the tensions around perfection and imperfection are going to shape the way we'll describe our Dead Sea sectarians, but also the way they're going to relate to other people who call themselves Jews or call themselves Israel. So I suggest here that the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls saw themselves as the only true remnant of the Jewish covenant. So the constant quest for perfection would lead to their salvation. Their view of themselves as the only true Jews created at best a complicated relationship with other Jewish leaders and communities. And what we will then go on to ask was the place of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their authors in Second Temple Judaism, and how did their exclusionary theology shape the Jewishness of their day? I'll admit that we're going to spend more time describing and less time answering the questions, but I hope that I'll set up the questions in such a way that you'll be able to come away from this talk with your own views of what sectarians and how they might have fit into Second Temple Judaism, and in particular into the Judaism that is the backdrop to the rabbinic movement and rabbinic Judaism, but that is not necessarily going to be the precursor to it. And I'll try to explain that in more detail as we go along. So let's take a moment to define our terms. I've tried to give you a few little splashes of imagery so that in case you get bored with the words, you have some pictures to look at. If we were in person, I would say raise your hand if you recognize this image, and a whole bunch of hands would go up and people would say, that's cave 4. That's the cave that's across from the habitation site where the Qumran sectarians lived. And that cave is full of, was found with thousands and thousands of fragments of very important texts connected with the sectarians. In order to lay the groundwork for us, though, I want to talk briefly about the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only true remnant of the Jewish covenant, which is what they saw themselves as, the constant quest for perfection, and the ultimate salvation. Each of these is a kind of designation that will allow us to unpack some of the pieces of thinking about our terms, and then we'll move on to what that allows us to say about them. So let's begin with the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when I say the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can read that broadly. The people who initially wrote the sectarian scrolls that I'll talk about in a moment, the people who read them, copied them, shared them with each other, and eventually collected them and hid them away, either because they weren't using them or because they were protecting them from what would eventually become the Roman violence. So when we talk about the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'd like us to be thinking about people who were connected in groups with one another, and that those groups formed movements. And the movement of sectarian Judaism in the Second Temple period was a kind of internally diverse and complicated set of groups. And people might have passed from one group into another, or they might have found a group they liked and stuck with it. But there are a couple groups in particular that we have a lot of evidence for. Please forgive me for saying a lot of evidence. If any of you study modern Judaism, you know this is a tiny bit of evidence, but it's a tiny bit of a lot of evidence because it's what we have. Scholars of antiquity have data envy when it comes to thinking about modern times and how to understand Jewish history. So I want to take just a second to talk about two different groups for whom we have evidence from the scrolls. The groups are related to each other in their theology. They use a lot of the same language, but not all of the same language. They probably knew each other, and like I said, they may have people may have passed from one group into the other. And you've probably heard of both of these groups, even though you may not have heard of them by name. The first group I want to reference calls itself the Yachad, the collective, the community. And the members of the Yachad understood themselves as attempting to achieve individual perfection as a collective. You've probably heard of the community rule. It's one of those 7 texts from the first cave of Qumran, and it's the one that really, really looks Essene-ish, if you will. It's full of rules and regulations that sound a lot like what Josephus talked about when he described these people. Rules and regulations that include the need for somebody to be studying Torah every night, the need for people to band together. You come and you join the group and you're in a kind of test mode for a long time. It's a sort of a 2-year process. You have a year of testing and then a second year of testing. If you do finally get accepted into the group, you not only get to participate in food and drink and partaking of ritual baths so that you're rendered materially pure, but you also know that your spiritual purity will be maybe not guaranteed, but something that at least puts you in the right starting place for it. The community rule brings together people who are going to share their possessions as well as their views and beliefs. They are going to ideally be organized in formal order under priests and Levites, and they're very structured, and the whole structure is set up in very biblical terms. And the little passage that I have at the bottom of the screen is from the Cave One Community Rule. And it's talking about all those who come into the council of the Yachad. So it's either the grouping within the Yachad or the group of the Yachad itself come into the covenant of God before all the volunteers. Now, this is going to make a lot more sense when we come to the end of the conversation, but the things that you will notice here is that there's a lot of movement inward going on, that this is probably a document for people who are individually joining up. They're mitnidavim, they're volunteers to this covenant. So one of the things we can say about the Yachad is it's connected with individuals, and these individuals are joining up. In a second, we'll see another group that seems to work in a slightly different way. Within the Yachad, we have references to Zadokite priests and Israelites, and this has led some people to think of the community associated with the Yachad as a priestly community. I don't think that it's ever been thought of as only containing priests. It's always been priests and other people, priests and Levites and Israelites, something like that. But there's a sense of priestliness about them. They are aspiring to the kind of ritual purity and the kind of moral purity that they associate with the priesthood of Zadokite priests, and that they see as a failure in the pseudo priests who are operating in Jerusalem and who aren't even Zadokite in their background. They might even be Hasmonean, and they're not good. They're messing up. And they're messing up a lot in very specific ways. So the members of the Yachad, the members of the community, are the first group that we're going to talk about here. Connected with them, we have wonderful texts, including a massive scroll of Thanksgiving hymns, a wonderful in the 19th century sense war scroll, which is full of wonders and is also supposed to be terrifying and awe-inspiring. And a number of other texts that show that this group is waiting for the end times, is very committed to their collective practices, is very committed to their purity and their perfection. Now, alongside this collected material, what's sometimes called the Serech material, because it's the order, or the Yachad material, we have material that doesn't use that word. It doesn't talk about its group as a Yachad. It talks about an Edah, a congregation. And it's interesting because this text, the Damascus document, doesn't have a lot of other supplementary texts with it in the way that the Yachad does. It does overlap a lot in terms of the quest for perfection, the emphasis on scripture, the commitment to a story of an Israel who have failed again and again and again, and who are only now going to be redeemed. And unlike the community rule, which does not reference marriage or families, in fact, it rejects those things because it's about individuals joining a group. The Damascus document seems to be the text for people who might have grown up inside, the children of the congregation. It has information on how you bring your kids up and what they're supposed to learn and how they become members of the group. So it is important to note that the community rule and the Damascus document overlap with each other, that they share a theology, but that they seem to reflect either different social tendencies. This is the one you need if you're joining the group, and this is the one you need if you've been there all along, or possibly that they reflect a difference in terms of whether people are living as families or not. And we can talk about family life versus individual celibacy. Even the married families are living in a very sexually constrained way. So there's no kind of rabbinic sort of marriage mode here. It's all either constrained perfection within family life with marriage and children, or constrained perfection that's being treated in terms of individuals. This is the moment when I would say, are there any questions? But Matt, do we have any questions yet, or no?
There's one person who just asked if you want to talk about the approximate dates of these groups a little bit.
Oh, thank you so much. I probably should have done that to begin with. When I say Second Temple period, I'm really talking about the later Second Temple period, so the time up to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Until recently, we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls in terms of about 100 BCE through 68 or 70 CE. Some recent scholarship on scrolls manuscripts suggests that we need to think of the community and the Edah as older than that, and possibly go back to old views of around, say, 150 BCE to like 70 CE. I apologize. I sort of took that for granted, and that is not quite appropriate. Thank you for giving me that clarification. So those are the people we're talking about, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them in terms of their individual and collective identity, but I want to move on to talk about their theology first. I never thought I would talk about theology. It's something that is not necessarily my strong suit, but I discovered that historical theology is very, very interesting. So we might ask each other, what do you believe? But I get more excited when we ask, what do they believe? So our sectarians, and I will eventually explain what I mean by the term sectarian, but our sectarians, particularly in the context of the stories told in the Damascus document, emphasize not only the notion of God's covenant with Israel, but a kind of stacked understanding that all the covenants with Israel are one covenant. Which is to say, we know from Bereshit, we know that God made a covenant with Abraham. We know that we talk about the covenants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know that when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt in the Exodus, that there is a new covenant that's formed, that's a national covenant, a collective covenant. And when the writers of the Damascus document or the people of the Adah are talking about their relationship, they frame themselves as participants in the covenant. And in fact, they frame it as the covenant with the first ones. You have here a line from the Damascus document from one of the medieval manuscripts, because there are two medieval manuscripts of that text, that in his remembering the covenant with the first ones, God created a remainder, allowed a remainder to remain of the people of Israel. So the covenant with the first ones is language that the Damascus document uses first to talk about the patriarchs and to talk about Moses and the children of Israel, but then also to talk about the founders of their group. So what happens again is it rolls back over itself so that you as a member of this group are a part of this group because God remembered the founders of your group, just as God remembered Moses, just as God remembered the children of Israel and the patriarchs and matriarchs. So there's a kind of theological claim here that's very, very big. It's not a small scale claim. And the idea that they are the remnant of Israel means that there was Israel's transgressions, there was an exile, there was maybe a return, but what's really happened is everyone who was part of Israel is no more, except for them. I think this gives you another piece of information if you're thinking about the relationship of our friends, the Covenanters, or the sectarians to the rest of Israel. Matt, may I ask you if there are other questions that would be clarifying? Or other stuff that if is
There's
someone's point.
a couple of questions. I mean, one person just asked, I mean, how many people were in the group?
Ah,
And
okay. So the rest we can hold.
yeah, we can.
Yeah. In terms of asking how many people were in the movement, we're kind of at a loss. I can tell you that the outside writers who wrote about the people they called Essenes used the number 4,000, which I think may translate to a whole bunch. If we're talking about the people who were actually at Qumran, the site itself is a habitation site, and there's not that kind of room for people there. There's been calculations made 3 or 4 different ways that suggest 150, 200 people could be there at one time, but that would be pretty packed full. So I think the best way to think about it is a movement of small Jewish groups. The text suggests that if you have 10 or more or 12 or more, you have to do certain things. So groups of maybe, I don't know, I think like a college professor, 10 to 40 people, and they gather together at certain times and places. To say there were 4,000 is not actually a number, but it does translate to a bunch of people, but in no way the majority. So let's stick with that for the moment. And I want to take just a second to talk about the constant quest for perfection, both because it's really interesting and also because it gives us another piece to hold on to when we think about these sectarians. One of the things that I've found in reading the scrolls is that there is a constant sense that God is perfect, that God manifests perfection, and that God would really like for all the good people to be perfect, but they never will be because they're not divine. The goal is to be as perfect as the angels. It's kind of an asymptotic relationship. If you think of it mathematically, you can get very close to perfection, but you can't get all the way there. Now, there are lots of ways you can try to attain perfection. And for our sectarians, some of those ways were more effective than others. One example of attaining perfection is a negotiation around ritual or embodied purity. So some of that is going to involve avoidance of sexual behavior, which can render you ritually impure. The issue, though, of being near a dead body is something that also requires purification. And we know both from the scrolls and from outside interpreters talking about them that the sectarians engaged in ritual immersion. They may have immersed before all of their meals. They may have immersed before all of their meetings. In any case, they immersed much more than modern Jewish people do, even the modern Jewish people who continue to immerse. This may be because the temple was still standing. It may be because they viewed themselves as an alternate temple. So one example of the way that their daily life worked is that they had the constant reminder of material purity as a means of pushing themselves towards perfection. So you have a beautiful picture there of a mikveh from Qumran, and you can see out into the wilderness behind it. This one is you can see it doesn't have one of the dividers, but there are some mikvaot or ritual immersion pools at Qumran that have a divider down the middle. So you can go down impure and come back up rendered pure. I talked about the ritual and sexual behavior. There's also a sense of moral perfection that you always have to be your best self. But being your best self, it's important to ask, what does that mean? And we'll talk a little bit about how that plays out for these people. There is also a desire for calendrical perfection, and I have indeed given hour-long lectures on the Qumran calendar. I will spare you now, but I will say it is the most fascinating, boring topic ever. You can see before you a map of 1/4 of the year. If you look closely, you'll see that it includes 91 days. There's a bonus day at the end of every quarter. The joy of a 91-day quarter is that you have weeks that begin on Wednesday. Every week begins on a Wednesday. Rosh Hashanah begins on a Wednesday. 1/4 of the year, Rosh Chodesh, begins on a Wednesday. Everything is absolutely perfect. It works out to a 364-day calendar. Days, weeks, months, years, seasons, holidays, and Shabbatot all work out perfectly, with their only one teeny tiny problem, which is that it doesn't work. You lose a day and a quarter every year, and before you know it, your whole calendar has slipped, and the holidays aren't at the right time, and you can't offer the right sacrifice. But they did understand why this was. It was because of sinfulness. If people hadn't been so sinful, if people had been as perfect as their calendar, if they had been as perfect as their ritual baths, then this would be perfect as well. So the aspiration for perfection brings with it tension, perhaps within the group, and certainly with respect to outsiders. And all of this is supposed to lead to their salvation. Now, I will tell you honestly, I hope you enjoy this slide image. I wanted something that conveyed the final battle between light and darkness, and I am pleased to provide you here with a view of free apocalyptic battle scene photo. I assume it is not a photo taken at the actual apocalyptic battle, but in any case, it's what you can imagine. The wicked are erased, the good are all purified, and it's important to keep in mind that up until this time, even the people destined to be saved are not in themselves perfect. And in fact, the perfection process is going to involve all of their imperfections being ripped out from within them. So we're not talking about a gentle transition here, but there was a belief that perfection and salvation in the end times were possible, even as they were very dangerous and very precarious. Okay, so this gives us a little bit of background. I hope that you've seen from here that we're talking about people who have very strong views of their own, whether it comes to the way they interpret the very stories of the patriarchs, whether it's the way they interpret the laws and traditions of the Jewish people, whether it's the way they interpret the practices at the temple in Jerusalem, and many of you have probably seen this model of the temple in Jerusalem. But this is a good place to shift over and ask a little bit about how all of those qualities put them in relation with the many, many, many more people of Israel whom they did not deem Israel, the many, many more Jews who they thought should not inherit the Jewish covenant with God. Again, Matt, I'll just stop and ask, are there any information questions?
I think you're good at the moment. One of the next questions was actually the relationship between the groups. So I think you're right on with,
Excellent,
yep.
excellent. Yeah. And I do appreciate people asking me to clarify things because sometimes it feels so familiar to me that I figure everyone has, spent their whole lives thinking about this stuff. So let's pivot. Let's get to the second of the 3 points that I thought we would look at, the relationship to fellow Jews. We've got this high stakes dynamic. We've got this perfectionism issue. We've got this response to a shared tradition. And we can say now that this movement, this group of communities and congregations and practitioners who may have even disagreed amongst themselves, nevertheless viewed themselves as the only true Jews. And it created, at best, a complicated relationship with other Jewish leaders and other Jewish communities. Um, One of the problems that we have with thinking about this, though, has to do with how we frame that relationship. Are we talking about separation? Are we talking about a split, a division, an alienation, an isolation? And what kinds of relationships might be possible in light of that kind of split or schism? The place where I'd like to start with this is going to be thinking about how individuals engage. But I then want to talk about how individuals function within a group and how the group functions with the larger Jewish world. So I want to think a little bit about um, how these views might have shaped the way a person could behave or would want to behave. Again, first individually, then within the group, and then in a larger way. So individually speaking, we do have language that tells us a little bit about what you can and can't do, or what you should and should not want to do when it comes to your interactions. So, for example, how are you supposed to manage living in a world with people who don't agree with you and are wrong, which is where they found themselves? And you have kind of two different views on how that might play out. We can ask the question, did the sectarians discuss religion with outsiders? Did they try to convince others of their views? Were they either proselytizing or haranguing, or were they just keeping themselves to themselves? And the answer, as I think we will find for a lot of the things we're going to talk about this evening, is yes. Yes, they did all of those things. We have the text that you have in front of you on the top right is a piece of 4Q Miksat Ma'aseh Torah, a few words of Torah, which is written. Some people say it's a real letter that was written to describe, to tell the people in Jerusalem what they're doing wrong. I suspect it may be a literary letter written to say what they would have said if they had written to those people, but possibly written as a reminder of what was said. But in MMT, you get this statement about we do this and y'all do that. And we think you're wrong because you do this thing. And it's all about temple practices. It's all about ritual purity. It's all about offering sacrifice. It's all about the things the priests do. And so the text very much reads like a statement of what the group thinks is right, or what an individual it's actually an individual in the group thinks is right, and that the other people should get their act together and maybe make some changes. So, on the one hand, you have either an argument for reaching out to others or a memory of a time when someone did reach out to others. One of the leaders of the group, and some of my colleagues would even say the teacher of righteousness, who's one of the founding memorialized leaders of the group. On the flip side, though, you have in the community rule, that text we talked about in column 10, a blunt statement that says that you're not supposed to argue with the men of perdition, meaning don't do it, don't go out there and argue, don't engage in that kind of behavior. Now, it's very tempting to read these things together with one another and to say that, and to create a whole narrative so that you could say, well, once upon a time, the leaders of the group tried to negotiate with these people in Jerusalem and it all ended really badly. And therefore, they say, don't negotiate with those people. Don't argue with the men of perdition. And that's one possible rendering. Another possible rendering, which feels very Jewish to me, is that people were constantly fighting about whether or not they should be fighting with people outside the group. so that at minimum, you have this tension that says either do argue with people who disagree with us or don't argue with people who disagree with us. So that's one form of relationship. Another form of relationship that we might encounter has to do with everyday life. Because whatever we say about these sectarians, we know that some of them lived in small groups. Some of them may have lived in Jerusalem. They may have lived in the Galilee. They're imagined as living kind of all over the place. And in that case, if you're a really small group, you may need to buy some of your stuff, or you may need to travel to go visit some of your kinsfolk, your spiritual kinsfolk. So you may find yourself interacting with other people. And it raises the question of what kinds of everyday activities were permitted or forbidden, and how did that play out? And here again, I think what's really interesting is something that I hadn't expected, because we find, again, in the community rule and also in the Damascus document, references to whom you can share with, who you can share your stuff with, because the community rule assumes that everyone's sharing everything. And the Damascus document, it's kind of, I hate to say kibbutz and moshav, but that's like the easy, that's the low hanging fruit as far as parallels go. That for the Damascus document, people kick in. There's a kuppah and people share, and then the things that the group needs come out of that. So it's interesting to note that members in both groups are told that you should not be sharing food with people from outside the group. You should certainly not be sharing liquids, because then you have an impurity problem. And even if they're people you used to know well, for example, people who were part of the group and left, you can't share with them. And there's this wonderful line from the community rule from column 5 that says, if somebody leaves the group, well, first of all, there's a kind of dead to me sense. You're dead to me. You're just not part of my group. And then there's a place where it looks like someone kind of amended the idea a little bit. So it says, you can't share anything with them unless you pay for it. So there's an idea that sharing brings you together, but that commercial exchanges might be okay because either because they're necessary or because they don't reflect the same kind of intimacy. So let me mention 2 more, and then I'll kind of summarize what we have here. In terms of family ties, I think I've mentioned enough times that the Damascus document assumes a family of origin, but the community rule does not. The community rule doesn't make reference. There's one poetic reference to a human being as son of woman. But that's really, really a poetic reference. And other than that, it doesn't say anything about when you leave your parents, or if you were ever married, or now that you've come and joined and there are people you've left behind. It's kind of like you're fully formed when you come to this group, and the group is your everything. And I think that plays out equally in what happens when a participant leaves the movement. Dead to me, as I said. So you have an interesting situation where the important way of an individual forming themselves is to form themselves within the group, and your emotional connections and your ties are to the group, but it may be have engagements with people outside the group as long as they're somehow distanced or separate. And that's where I think it's really interesting. You can't take something from someone, but you can buy it. It's a decrease in intimacy. It's a rejection of intimacy. Let's see how we're doing for time. Okay. I won't go on for too much longer, but I want to talk for just a second about identity formation within the movement. So we've got this idea of the perfection and the idea of the end times and all this intensity. And now we've got this notion of separation from the group. And I want to introduce the idea of tension as a sociological concept. Tension in this sense does not have to do with one's internal experience, but with degree of difference from the mainstream. Rodney Stark and William Sims Bainbridge use this idea very, very productively. It's used by other sociologists as well, to suggest that if you have difference and separation, you begin to have tension with a mainstream because you don't look like them, you don't act like them, and you don't let yourself be, the way I would put it here is kind of spiritually intimate with them. And in addition, once you add hostility, you have degrees of tension from the mainstream. And that's where we're going with this conversation. How much tension were these sectarians in with regard to the mainstream? whether that was tension built on being physically removed or whether that was tension built on being spiritually removed even while physically close by. I also want to mention social identity theory, which was introduced to the scrolls by Jutta Jokiranta. She's a wonderful sociologist of the scrolls, and she argues that social identity theory is the mix of how an individual understands themselves, how they understand themselves with respect to the group, and then how they understand the group with respect to outsiders. So in some way, her work has colored everything I'm presenting here because I'm trying to get you to see our sectarians with a certain outlook and mentality, religious, spiritual, but also like material and emotional, and to show you that their deepest connections are within the group and that their experience of separation allows them to be within the group and separate from the outside. But again, I want to negotiate that idea of separation. So I want to ask the question, what sectarian schism looks like? Because I think it's possible for people to feel separate without being separate. Philip Davis has this idea of sectarianism where he argues that you can have sectarian tendencies without actually forming a new group. And again, I think this is wonderfully Jewish, that you can disagree with other Jewish people about a whole bunch of things and still be part of the same group. But if you disagree about an important specific thing, the groups might shatter. So one of the things that Davis or Davies wants us to notice is that a large movement can have groups within it who agree on some things and disagree on others. But what they may have in common is that they all disagree on what's worse about the third guy. So it raises these questions. Can you be separate and still share a space? Can you be separate theologically and still buy fruit from somebody? Or does separation require isolation? Do you need to remove yourself their presence? Now, with that question in the works, I have two more slides that are to the third thing, and then we'll open it up for a bit of discussion. The first of these is the idea of finding a place in their world. I've suggested to you that we have individuals who've made a point of joining groups, and if you look at the sociological definition of sectarianism, it's all about the mitnidavim. It's all about the vaz. It looks like we have a lot of questions. I hope that's a good place to stop and leaves us time for lots of conversation.
Yes, thank you, Professor Grossman, for a very interesting and engaging lecture. As you mentioned, there are many questions coming in, and those of you out there are welcome to add more. One theme that I've noticed across a number of questions that have popped up is which you also mentioned sort of at the end there a little bit about Christianity, and there's a number of different questions. Somebody asked about John the Baptist, maybe being familiar with the Dead Sea sect. Maybe if you want to say a little bit more about the potential relationship or anything we might know about early Christianity and the sectarians.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also, it looks like there's some other questions as well. I think that one of the things we see, I mean, we have to be fair here. We have to, you notice that I kind of quoted all my scholars and I gave them credit. We have to give Josephus credit for a lot of what we know about this period. And we know what he thought was interesting. So he's really interested in all the different groups and are they similar to like the Greek philosophical clubs or are they different? But we know from him that there were a lot of different movements and claims going on in this period. And we frankly know from Tanakh and from the texts that were not included in the Tanakh that people's minds were directed in lots of different ways. So if you think about the Ketuvim, if you think about the last books of the Jewish Bible, and if you think about the books that were collected in the Apocrypha, which are in some Christian Bibles, but which were really written by Jews, then you know that Jewish people in this day, some of them were waiting for the end times. Some of them were writing poetry. Some of them were saying, get it together, get a job, make your parents proud. That's wisdom literature. And you have every other kind of thing going on as well. So in terms of the way people thought, the literature they relied on, and the way they felt religiously, there were lots of different things to read and hear and learn and study. But there were also a lot of movements that kind of interspersed along religious and communal lines or religious and political lines. So there's a reference to the Zealots, who Josephus describes as a very particular group. I think if I'm reading him right, he sees them as an offshoot of the Pharisees, which is to say, an offshoot of kind of mainline Judaism, whose main goal is to try to get rid of the Romans. Um, in contrast, um, alongside our sectarians, we also have evidence for John the Baptist, who was also operating in precisely this area in the Judean desert, and he was baptizing people. And we have Jesus, who had disciples, and he was up in the Galilee, but then he came down, and he was in the Jerusalem area. And there's other people, Judah the Galilean. There's a lot of different people who were attracting students and attracting disciples. Now, what's interesting about the earliest Christians is that some of the arguments that they're having, that we have evidence for in the New Testament, parallel precisely the arguments that our guys are having. So there's a whole question going on in this period about divorce. Now, I know that everyone in the room who knows about rabbinics is able to say, well, the rabbis said divorce was okay. You need divorce because not all marriages work out, and you shouldn't live miserably. You should live happily with a happy spouse and have happy children. So divorce is a very reasonable thing. But that's the rabbis. That's later. What we have in the Second Temple period is a lot of arguments about divorce. So you have Jesus saying, basically, when there's a divorce, God cries. Divorce is bad. You have other people who are saying, well, can you just sort of take a second wife and can we just not really talk about it? And then you have this very interesting passage in the scrolls that argues that a man should not take a second wife in their lifetime. Well, does that mean he shouldn't have two wives at the same time, which we do know was sometimes going on? Or does it mean that if he got divorced, he couldn't divorce and remarry somebody else because he's still married to that woman because divorce isn't really divorce? Um, you have questions in the New Testament about whether you need to wash and say a bracha before you eat. John the Baptist's disciples do, Jesus's don't. Um, you have questions about how to keep Shabbat and how to keep certain holidays and calendar. And so I would argue that the Dead Sea sectarians are asking the same questions that other Jews are asking, including Jews who went on to go follow John the Baptist and who went on to go follow Jesus or went on to go follow Jesus's brother James. But what ultimately ended up happening is that in Christianity, there was a push away from halacha and toward a kind of moral and metaphorical explanation of all the things that practical Judaism does. And our guys are in the middle. They're creating that same moral and metaphorical explanation, and they're saying you have to do the things. So I would not suggest that any of the Qumran sectarians were part of Christian movements. It's possible that you get what are sometimes called seekers, these people who sort of pop in from one movement to another. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if people test drove the Qumran sectarian movement and then also test drove John Baptist and picked from there. Um, I do think that the tendencies of the sectarians include tendencies that got picked up and run with in Christianity. But I think if, Shlomo in Jerusalem is trying to decide what he wants to do and be and believe. He's got a lot of choices. And it's possible that he'd be like, John the Baptist is all right, but I like the Qumran guys. I kind of don't know how they're different from each other, but they are. Is that kind of a fair rendering?
Yeah, I think so. As a follow-up, somebody asked if it's they see a comparison somewhat to today with the different denominations in Judaism, and was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, like there's like conservative reform, Reconstructionist, and so
Well, this
on.
is a data envy question. This is a true data envy question because if you look, for example, at the reform movement and at the platforms that are the formal statements of what the reform movement means, you can go back to the American Reform kind of founding document from 1885 from Pittsburgh, where they're like, no more kashrut. What are you talking about? What is this Israel thing? No, 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 no. And it's the pendulum has gone all the way in one direction. And then if you look at the 1937 platform, or especially the 1999 platform, you get this American Reform Judaism that's deeply committed to the moral and ethical claims of the original documents while using Hebrew, talking about Shabbat, talking about meaningful practice, talking about Israel. So we lack that with Qumran. We have multiple copies of the Community Rule and multiple copies of the Damascus document, and there are some differences, but we can't tell, like, the differences aren't as big as that, but we don't have access to a kind of understanding of how things developed. So I can tell a story of how the movements grew and changed, but I'm going to have a lot of missing pieces in that story. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that if you give Jewish people a Torah or a Tanakh, the arguments write themselves. You know, do you need to kosher fish? Our guys say so. The rabbis don't. You know, it's all there and waiting to be discussed. I hope that's a fair answer and not a flippant one.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a fair answer.
David Goldstein asks, did the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls sometimes change the words of Torah because of their agenda? David Goldstein, I think you may know, you may be onto something there, and you may know something that you're hinting at. When scholars were first reading the scrolls in the early 1950s and down into the 1980s, there was this real sort of curiosity. Look at all the things they got wrong. Look at all the things they didn't quite quote properly. And we've come to two conclusions about their, if you will, wrongness in terms of the way they think about Tanakh or Torah. The first is that the texts themselves were a lot more diverse, and we have Hebrew evidence for texts that fit with the Masoretic text, but also with texts that fit with what the Samaritans or the Septuagint Christian Bible look like. So there was more diversity in what the words said, but yeah, they also played around with scripture beautifully, and they played around with in primary and secondary ways. You'd be reading something and you'll find there's there's referential language that's very much like almost, I mean, I don't know if I could say piyut, but certainly like the way the rabbis play with texts. There's a reference to that it draws on, I think it's Ezekiel, the Zadokite priests, the Levitical priests, the sons of Tzadok, the Kohanim Leviim Bnei Tzadok. And our guys say, no, 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 no. That's the Kohanim and the Leviim and the Bnei Tzadok. So they take this one very fancy priestly expression and they turn it into the founders of their group and the group in its day. So they play with scripture very knowingly to their own devices. Yes. And it can be really fun. I was reading part of the admonition to the Damascus document, and I kept finding partial references. And actually, there's a wonderful book by a guy named Campbell where he pulls out all the biblical references in the Damascus document. And you go back and look, and I just kept encountering passages where a line or two later there would be a reference to cattle or cows. And it was like there were hidden cows all over this text. And I was like, where are these cows coming from? And then my lovely spouse said to me, temple sacrifice? And I kind of went, oh, yeah, okay. So yeah, they're always telling at least one more story than the story you think they're telling. Art Hessel asks if Cave 4 was like a Geniza, and that's entirely possible, and it's possible in two ways. We know that Cave 4 was in two portions, and it apparently got trashed in antiquity. It's not clear whether that was a kind of natural disaster or whether that was the action of somebody destroying it. But it's possible that the scrolls from Cave 4 were already fragmentary because it was a place where people had been storing damaged materials or materials that were gonna be put away somewhere. There's a very, very interesting book by Hartmut Stegemann where he talks about how the different caves might have been for different things. And I think that's really, really neat. And I think Cave 1 is especially important because if you know the story about the scrolls jars with the linen and the lids, that's predominantly in Cave 1. And that stuff was preserved really, really well. And that stuff supports the Essene hypothesis. So what you and the Cave One community rule is the longest, and it sort of combines all the pieces of earlier traditions. So it's kind of like a master version of it. And I like to think that someone somewhere was like, this is our PR. We're getting our version of this argument, and it's right here. And they had tremendous success between 1948 and 1991. So kudos to the Cave One folks. And then Cave Four caught up. Shelby Shapiro asks if I've been on site. I have had the pleasure to go to Qumran several times, including the summer that my younger brother got married, and I was permitted to schlep my family out there and give them a guided tour. So yes, I am a big fan. It's been fascinating to see how the site has changed, not materially, but in terms of how it's presented. When I was there in the 1980s, there were labels like scriptorium and refectory, which really, really leaned into the perception of this as a celibate, almost Christian Jewish monastery. And then when I was there more recently, there were much more neutral signs, but there was also a lot of Jewish Christian swag in the gift shop. And the movie, the tourist movie that you watched, pretty much implied that John the Baptist hung out there. So yeah, we definitely see different kinds of framing over time in the site itself. Matt, did you identify any questions that you found especially exciting?
There.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm sorry. Yes.
oh no, you go. Yeah.
Okay. Sarah Brooks asks where the living water comes from in these mikvaot, and that is an excellent question because it is dry. It is a desert. There are dry riverbeds, wadis all around. The Qumran site itself is built on a plateau, and it slopes off on the sides, and there's a wadi in between the site and Cave 4. But if any of you have been in the Judean desert in the winter or in the rainy season, you probably know that you get these massive just dumps of rain and flooding, and it's sort of shocking. And we suspect that what happened is that when there's a kind of water course that runs through the site, and then a whole bunch of mikvaot. And some of the mikvaot are so large that it's probably wiser to think of them as reservoirs with one section cut off for a mikvah and the rest of it is just, we need water. So in the wintertime, the water would come down the mountain. There's a kind of containment basin kind of thing. It's basically like a huge sandbox on the edge of the site, and the water would pour through there. The silt would ideally drop out. The water would pass along the plastered channels, fill these reservoirs and mikvaot. There's one giant round one that's from much earlier, that's probably from the Israelite period, and then all the rest are these rectangular ones. And then scholars say they probably covered them. They were probably kept covered so you didn't have as much of a problem with evaporation. So yeah, when we say living water, it's living, but it may have been murky. It may have been there for the better part of a year by the time you're going into it. So we can talk about how ritual purity is not the same thing as physical cleanness, although they're both attempts to get towards perfection. Bill Halpern asks if the strain in relationships with the outside Jewish community ever broke out into violence. And I don't have evidence for that, but I do have two very interesting comments on that. I love to not answer a question in a content-rich way. Um, uh, the first is that the War Scroll, which is found from Cave One, and so it's one of these other Yachad type texts, imagines cataclysmic violence. It imagines the violence at the end times, that my wonderful little picture of a war kind of thing. And it imagines that that violence is going to take place between the remnant of Israel and everybody that Israel's ever been in a fight with. So all of the going back to the Canaanites and going back to the Amalekites, anybody who was ever in conflict with Israel, there's going to be this battle, and it's going to be the Yachad and the angels on their side, and then the bad guys and the angels on their side, and the angel Belial or Beliar is going to be their leader, and they're going to go back and forth, and it's a kind of choreographed battle. So it's a kind of imagined violence that's very intense, but that we don't have any evidence that it's like a product of real events. However, we do have a story from one of the commentary texts, the Pesher texts, that talks about a fight between the teacher of righteousness, who's kind of one of the founding imagined figures of the Scrolls community, and someone who's called the Wicked Priest. A lot of ink has been spilled on which of the Hasmoneans the Wicked Priest is, or whether it's a reference to all of them in sequence, or whatever it may be. We know that there is a sense of the priesthood in Jerusalem as not only flawed and failing, but as the enemy of our people. And there's a story that's told about how the wicked priest came out to the place where the teacher of righteousness was to yell at him and torment him on his Yom Kippur. Now, again, the rabbis have a very similar story about a power struggle around calendar, where a rabbi is made to come on his own Yom Kippur to travel and bring his staff and bring his bag and basically transgress his Yom Kippur to prove that his calendar is not the right one. So there is both imagined cataclysmic conflict and there is remembered or imagined remembered sectarian conflict. We don't have evidence in the scrolls for actual conflict, but then we don't have a lot of evidence in the scrolls for actual anything. What we have is what they said about what they did and what they said about what they felt. Again, I hope that's a reasonable non-answer to a very good question. Sarah Reiterband asks if we know the percentage of the Jewish world they represented, and we really, really don't. We know they were a minority. We know that in every time and place, there have always been Jewish groups with quirky ideas relative to the mainstream. But we also can see at least the perception or imagination of other groups like this. In addition to the Dead Sea Sectarians, or to put it another way, in addition to the stories that Philo in Alexandria in Egypt tells about Essenes, he knows or claims to know about Essenes. He's living in Alexandria. He knows about them in Israel. But he also talks about a group who lived near him called the Therapeutai, who were absolutely celibate and who sat around like reading Torah and writing music. And then on Shabbat and on holidays, they would sing together. So there's a sense of like the ability to get away from the world and into relationship with God that we find in other places as well as a Jewish concept. And again, you can see it reverberate through time. You can ask about the Hasidic tradition. You can ask about the various mystical traditions, you know, the traditions of Tzfat. I wouldn't be so simplistic as to say that it's built into the Jewish tradition, but I think there are places where it can easily be revived if people are looking for it. And there is, I think, a kind of linear sort of mystical tendency that does crop up pretty regularly. I'm going to take just a second to look at the questions that are here. Oh, very nice question, Chris. Thank you for your question about the sectarians in all of their perfection. Yeah, no, I think it's enormously important to remember that when we talk about anybody living in, you know, whether they're in the Galilee or Judea or the desert or Jerusalem or the coast, if they're living in, say, the first century BCE through the first century CE, they've experienced close to 200 years of casual Hellenistic reality around them. If they go to a big city, it's a Hellenistic city. If they want to learn philosophy, like the avenue to philosophy is Greek language, the avenue to elite status is Greek. And so while the sectarians are creating a kind of Gentile free zone, and they certainly are not real fans of Gentiles any more than they're fans of Jews who aren't Israel, which is who they are. They nevertheless function in a Hellenistic, post-Hellenistic culture in the same way that no matter how hard you might try to live an ultra-Orthodox Jewish life in isolation today, you will nevertheless encounter other languages than Yiddish. You will encounter other people than yourself. But I think it's important to note that um, it's all on a sliding scale. If you think about we're coming up on Hanukkah, get started on your shopping. That when the Maccabean revolt was a revolt against desecration of the temple, against a Hellenized Syrian assault, against a kind of pagan god who's going to be put in the place of the God of Israel, and all of that was deemed Hellenistic. I mean, it was Syrian, it was Egyptian, but it was Hellenistic Syrian, it was Hellenistic Egyptian. And the Hasmoneans come out fighting, and it's all about this rejection of assimilation. And these guys ultimately form an independent kingdom for 100 years and have names like Alexander. I mean, their rejection of Hellenization might be real, but it's also in a Hellenized setting, right? You can say that we in no way want to be influenced by outsiders, by any of their Gentile perversions. And oh, I'll have a Coca-Cola, please, while we talk about that, right? There's culture, and then there's your chosen culture, and the backdrop can be a part of where you are. So I think that both because they were functioning in a potentially Hellenized space, particularly if they were elites, who were moving out from Jerusalem and moving away because they hated what the other elites were doing, they would have had a high exposure to Hellenistic culture. And also, if what we know about them is influenced by the writings of Josephus and Philo, those guys were really, really Hellenized. So everything we learn from them is going to be framed in a way to say, our our religious people are just as intellectual as your religious people, and our small sectarian groups are just like the Stoics or the Pythagoreans or something. So we have to be careful not to impose too much external Hellenism onto our reading of the scrolls, but they did live in a Hellenized culture. They did live in a culture that had access to Babylonian culture. As much as they wanted to avoid any kind of rubbing shoulders with imperfection, they lived in a world where Aramaic was a real language and where Greek may have been a real language, where those were parts of their world as well. I hope that wasn't too yes and no, yes and no. I hope that was more concrete than it sounded. Thank you, someone, for sending up a heart. Um, Matt, do you have any other favorites?
One that I had been looking is actually the next one on the list there is about the sectarians. What was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, if it matched what was in the Mishnah and Talmud, if or uh,
Yeah, no, there's some wonderful overlaps. I wouldn't say matched, but they're definitely struggling with the same problems. So you have both the temple scroll, which is a very, very, very long scroll that talks about proper temple practice. And you also have, again, I keep mentioning Miksat Maaseh Torah, which I think is such a classy title. It's like, we just have a few places where we disagree with you. But the disagreements and the descriptions in the temple scroll show that there were real questions about how ritual purity was supposed to work, what the priests are supposed to do, the technical differences of things. When does Shabbat begin? And that's also, I think, really cool because it's the kind of thing that I think the first time I read it, I thought, that feels so normal. That feels so like human Jewish people talking about stuff. They say Shabbat begins when the sun is its own height above the horizon. Like, isn't that just so like, I know exactly when that is. I can spot that. Um, but it's actually really fussy if you compare that to what the rabbis say, because that's certainly more than 18 minutes, right? So they're very fussy in the choices that they make, but that fussiness is all within a set of shared questions about ritual practice, around food, around Shabbat, around sex, around temple practice. Matt, does that sound like
oh, I think you just went on mute.
how does that work?
Yeah.
Oh, there's a neat question about the cost of daily life. And this is a really, really interesting one because again, um, you get, if you think from the perspective of Josephus and Philo, these people don't have anything. They're perfect and pure, and they like don't need any money, right? They're just like They're separate from all things. But the scrolls are very clear that when you join the group, after you've been tried and tested, you hand over your property. Or in the case of the Damascus document, you hand over a chunk every year. But if we think particularly about the Serach HaYachad, the Yachad community, they've got everything that people handed over. So on the one hand, some of the scrolls that we have that are in a different handwriting or that seem to have a different tradition, they may have been part of people's treasures that they brought when they joined in. Here I am, my name is Shlomo, I have a copy of the book of Tobit, and I have a copy of the book of Exodus, and I have these silver coins, and I'm so happy that I passed my 2-year mark, and I want to hand all these things over, and now I'm part of the group. We suspect that they were pretty elite, pretty well off. You can't kind of abscond to the desert without sources and resources. There are some farms that seem to be connected with Qumran in Feshka and in Guer. There's a lot of dates grown there now, and there's actually a reference to palm trees in that area from our same time period. So they may have been farming dates. We know that they were making their own pottery. We know that there's a large hoard of silver coins that were found. They probably got buried in an earthquake, which was a huge bummer, but they represent a lot of money relative to like day laborer wages. And the site itself had nice architecture. Not fancy. We're not talking Herod here. And it's not even high fancy. It's like nice. And then there was an earthquake on the site and it was rebuilt and it was fine, but it was no longer nice, if that makes sense. So a couple of columns in the first build, the columns didn't get put back up again after the earthquake. A very nice collection of silver coins that got lost. So we're probably talking about people who did buy and sell from strangers and who did probably receive hand to hand from other members of their gang. You can imagine if potentially a movement where there would be other farms in other places and people might bring stuff in and share stuff with each other. But I do think it's necessary to think of them as at least, if not elite, then just below elite status, because you can't do this stuff without resources. And so there probably was buying and selling and trading. Oh, Sarah Brooks, what a hard and good question about sectarian tension, and isn't that what we feel today? This is a painful one, and I sometimes think of the work that I do on the scrolls as regrettably relevant. Up until recently, I would have said that Jews were not sectarian these days. That sectarian means I'm right, you're wrong, God's going to pick me, and you're going to disappear. And I think there's a reason why the Dead Sea sectarians didn't win and the rabbis did. I mean, the sectarians were like, oh, those seekers after smooth interpretations, those dorshe halakot, which sounds a lot like halachot. They're compromising, and compromise is bad. God doesn't want us to compromise. I think that you're not a sectarian until you say God doesn't want us to compromise with each other. And maybe I'll just leave that thought there for the moment on that topic. So there's this great, Nina Tarley, you have this great question about what the scrolls tell us. And I would say that not so much their nastiness, but their kind of marginalization has made them less important for a long time. But the discovery, well, first of all, in the primary way, the discovery is a delight. It's a reminder that there is always something else to see. Don't give up hope. There's going to be something new to learn. So in a kind of, if I was going to think in a moral theological way, I think in a way the scrolls allow us to open our eyes and say there will be more stuff to discover and see. And that's not exactly a scholarly view, but it's more of a personal one. From a scholarly perspective, what the scrolls tell us is that we better watch out and not assume we know what's happening, because the scrolls sectarians point to things that people said would never have been possible. For example, they need their people to be perfect, right? So if their people need to be perfect, they can't have suspicion. Suspicion is deadly to perfection. So they tinker with the rules of witnesses. The rabbis say you got to have 2 witnesses. They're like, you know what? If you've got one witness and then the guy does it again and you got a second witness, 1 + 1 is 2. Kick him out. Because they're so strict, they have to let women serve as witnesses around certain things. It's usually around people's sexual behavior, which is kind of a bummer. It would be nice if they were, observing whether someone was, offering a sacrifice properly. But I think the scrolls remind us that Judaism is a lot more complicated and that there's a lot more possibility in our past than we ever thought could be. So yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount to gain from understanding the things that these people did. Even as they said, we're right and you're wrong, they said it in very interesting ways that help us to understand some of the complexities of Jewish practice, Jewish law, and also like why people read Tanakh. They really, really cared about their tradition. They really believed it mattered. And they're kind of a reminder that it's worth reading those things, that there's something to gain from them. Um, can I talk about the Book of Jubilees?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I love the Book of Jubilees. Hold on just 1 second. I'll be right. Very good. Just letting a door shut. The Book of Jubilees is preserved in its completest form in the Ethiopian community. We have Jubilees in Latin and we have Jubilees in the Ethiopic, but we don't have a lot of Jubilees in other languages. It's a recounting of the whole history of Israel from creation to the giving of the law at Sinai. And it intersperses, along with the stories, the specific legal interpretations that they want you to take as fact. So they'll describe a story and they'll say, and this is why, this is when the law was given that said thus and such, or this is why we do this thing. So it's kind of like a sectarian legal treatise written in a story. It's also kind of brilliant because it frames the whole history of the Jewish people in terms of cycles of jubilees, so 49, 50-year cycles. And it designates the things that have happened in terms of what jubilee and year it is. So it basically tells you exactly how long things were when they took place. So, for example, in the Book of Jubilees, they have to deal with the problem that Abraham and Jacob were alive at the same time, which Torah never touches. It's just not relevant. So Jubilees actually creates these wonderful conversations between these two patriarchs and their relationships with each other that are like, if you will, a kind of big midrash on the patriarchs, including dropping Isaac out of the picture because the poor guy gets no attention. But Jubilees is this wonderful example of simultaneously scriptural interpretation, humanization of heritage, and insistence on a particular legal and calendrical practice. It's a very convincing text in that way. Oh, how soon are the end times coming? I like to say Tuesday. It's very the one of the things that's interesting and it's very frustrating because we don't know when these different texts were written in terms of specificity. So, like for example, if I told you that somebody said something about Israel in 2020, or somebody said something about Israel on October 8th of 2023, those are radically different contexts for whatever that person might say about Israel. And we don't have that granularity with the scrolls. We don't have that specificity. So it's a lot of guessing. But within that context, you have places where they say, the end times are coming. You better get right with God. And then they say, the end times are coming. It's almost time to get right with God. And then you have texts that say, can't get right with God anymore. You're just toast. So we do know that there's internal movement, but we already have in the canonical Jewish Bible that same kind of stuff going on in the book of Daniel. If you look at the last few chapters of the book of Daniel, it tells you how many days it's going to be until everything wraps up, but it gives you two different predictions. So there's a kind of tinkering. And what's really kind of wild, to take us way off the subject, is in the 19th century in the US, in the 1840s, during the era of the Great Disappointment, There were Christians who read the book of Daniel and they read the Christian book of Revelation, and they charted when the world was going to end, possibly just like our sectarians, certainly just like the book of Daniel and Revelation. And they were waiting. They were waiting at Pesach in 1843, and they waited again and again and again, and they kept being disappointed. Which I think is a reminder that our dear sectarians were probably disappointed as well, unless they viewed the Roman conquest as the end of the world, in which case it might have been.
We have, I mean, we only have a few minutes left. I don't know. You can check out if you see another question there that you're interested in, or if you have some kind of summary thoughts that you would like to leave us with.
Lovely. I would actually, just taking, oh, a quick question about messianic views. When the scrolls were first discovered, and again, our friends who loaded up Cave One, had a high priority to think about messianism. They were expecting an end times Messiah who was going to come. The people were going to be saved, and there's a very clear narrative when you look at that. And because those scrolls represented the larger knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, up into the early 90s, there was a long history of thinking about the scroll sectarians as messianic and as proto-Christian. But a lot of the material from Cave 4 was really halachic. And a lot of that material was like, this is what they should be doing in the temple, and this is how we should be keeping our holidays. And it was much more kind of on the ground materially Jewish. And again, I think you can see some kind of an internal schism between those two traditions, even among the scroll sectarians. People don't talk about the messianic expectations with the scrolls as much anymore. There's still plenty to read about that. But I think that the point I'd like to make in wrapping up is that for all that these truly sectarian people really believed that they were it and nobody else was going to be saved but them, in making those very exclusionary claims, they provide evidence for a truly dynamic moment in the history of the Jewish people and the history of Israel, when questions were being asked and answered from the perspective of practical wisdom, but also from the perspective of poetry, and also from the perspective of throwing yourself to God and asking God to save you. There was a lot of just trying to get by, and there were a lot of people who were trying to do better. And I think that the scrolls are one of the other things they gave us is, on the one hand, this narrow story of this very exclusionary group, but on the other hand, a lot of evidence for how complicated, dynamic, and vibrant Jewish history, culture, and community were in this very period. And that might be a nice place to stop.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a beautiful way to end the program. And so thank you once again for sharing all your expertise and tackling all these excellent questions from everyone out there. So I'm sure everyone really enjoyed your learning with you and this evening together. So.
Thank you so much. It's been a lovely opportunity.